The following webinar was recorded on April 17th, 2017 by Cognitive Edge. Hello everybody, I'm Lori Webster, the Premium Member Coordinator and a SenseMaker practitioner. Happy to have you here today. Welcome to our webinar. The topic is how Cynefin and SenseMaker methods work with Agile. Now this ties all in with a masterclass that Dave Snowden will be giving. It's called the Agile Gurugram Masterclass on Complexity, Cynefin and Agile in India at the end of May, the 27th and 28th. That's being organized both by Cognitive Edge and Innovation Roots, where we're supposed to have two panelists here from Innovation Roots, Nupur and Prashant, consultants. They're having some technical difficulties with the connection. So is Dave Snowden. He's here, but I'm unable to get his beautiful picture up on the screen for you all to ooh and ah over. I know you'll get me for that later, Dave. Anyway, this webinar is also the masterclass. One more thing about the masterclass is that it's association with the Scaling Agile Institute, which I believe is where a lot of the folks who signed up for the webinar are coming from. Let me talk a little bit about how the webinar is supposed to go today. It's 1 hour. We're going to be recording it, and it should be available in approximately 5 days. Dave will talk for about 30 minutes. Then we like to open it up to questions. You can post your question. There is a question box in the GoToWebinar panel. And if you want your microphone not to be turned on when we get to your question, please say, don't turn on mic, and then we'll just read your question. I also need to apologize in advance for mispronouncing any of the Indian names. I'm really sorry. I'm probably going to mess them up. Hopefully, Nupur, if she's here, will be able to help correct, or maybe Dave is just really good at Indian names and I don't know that. So let me just see. Are you? Oh no, I've lost Nupur also. Okay. So Dave, it looks like I'm going to turn it over to you now, and you can share your thoughts about this topic, and especially if you think there's something that would be helpful for the people who are considering the masterclass at the end of May.
Okay. If I could actually show you a video, then you'd see I'm parked outside the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford. So we're moving on from this to performance of Julius Caesar, so I'm getting myself ready for blood and gore. Yeah. So if that influences what I say, my apologies. In terms of background, I started in IT. It was quite interesting really at school. One of the things the headmaster, he insisted we do two things. One of which was brilliant. He made us all sit RSA stage 3 typing. Now you have to remember this is 1972. We are the 5% of the British population which will go to university. We're in grammar school. We've been selected as an academic elite at the age of 11, and he's making us do something which only thick people do because they can't get into our school. So we all protested. But he said typewriting skills were going to be key to the future. So that was insightful. I mean, I still get irritated on chat lines because nobody can type fast enough in terms of the way you work. The other thing he also did was he made us learn how to use punchcard machines because he said that was a backup. We'd have a job for life. Now, of course, that was less effective, but I do think those of us who learned to code on punchcards have more discipline. If you've got a compile error on card 3, then you sort of learn to have some discipline in the way you programmed. Now, interestingly, we can see some repetition at the moment. I was at the big conference on the future of education in Washington last week. And one of the points I made there is that we're over-focusing on STEM education and we're over-focusing on technical skills in schools and universities, and we're not focusing on understanding people and understanding social interaction. I mean, if you want a prediction, I would say most of the stuff we're teaching kids how to code now will be done by AI systems by the time they graduate. But we're actually moving them into an environment in which they have no wider understanding of human culture, human interaction, human cognition, all the sort of things that programmers need to understand but rarely engage with. And to some extent, the Agile Manifesto, if you go back to the original Snowden work, was all about re-engaging with people, not re-engaging with code. I want to come back and address that in a minute. Yeah. Either way, from that, I went on to university, eventually ended up in a mixture of accountancy and personnel roles. In the early days of computing, I built some of the early PC-based systems. Days when if you've got a PC and DB2 and a secretary was prepared to swap 5¼ inch floppy disks every 20 minutes, we could outperform the mainframe in terms of personnel records, and went from there to 3GLs, 4GLs, picked up again on Fortran and COBOL, and then went into advanced languages like Prolog and expert systems. So I'm that generation which has grown up from not knowing about computers and thinking calculators were really cool, into the generation which has moved into the point where we're now what I call pervasive computing, the Internet of Things, where you just don't even think about technology anymore, you just take it for granted. And if I go walking these days, I've got about 15 separate apps in operation on the mountains. And the most important thing is to actually have backup batteries and support power, because otherwise everything breaks down. So I've seen through that history. And in that history, I've seen a constant flux between user focus and capability focus, not just within the Agile movement, but on a wider basis. So consultants, for example, switch between focus on capability to focus on industry. So kind of like they focus on capability, they discover they don't have enough industry knowledge, so then they switch the pendulum and organize by industry. Then they realize that they don't have enough capability knowledge, so this whole goes backwards and forwards on a 5 to 6 year cycle. And what nobody ever does is to look at context. So if I take that example from consultancy, in a mature industry, you need to have a mature market. You need high levels of industry focus because your product is now stable. What is varying is its application and specialist application. In an emerging or novel market, what matters is capability focus, because nobody has quite worked out what the application will do yet. So you need to have deep horizontal capability across multiple industries. So that really led into what I call a both and, not an either or phenomenon.
Oh,
and I would say the same.
Did you say both and?
Both and,
okay.
Not either or.
Got it.
And I say the same is true of Agile. The Agile Manifesto rightly switched the focus back to users, but it swung the pendulum too far. And the reality is, anybody who's been in IT all their lives, as I have, knows users never know what they want until they get it, and then when you give it to them, they want something different. And the reason is not that they're perverse. The reason is fundamentally that they're not aware of the potentiality of what technology can do until you give them something. Then they realize what they should have really asked for. So you're in this sort of negative reversal process, which is actually quite dangerous. So just to give you an example of two major programs we're about to launch from the Cynefin Center at Bangor University. One is working with Excelos to create a complexity-based approach to project management, which will be a major new release of Prince 2 in 2 years' time. Now, what we're doing there is, a lot of people in Agile hate things like Prince 2, they call it Waterfall. We're actually saying there's nothing wrong with Waterfall techniques. If you've got a highly structured requirement, a resource pattern which you know, and a set of delivery dates that you've got to achieve, there ain't anything wrong with it. One of the things we did back in the 90s when we created the DSDM consortium, I was one of the 3 executives who created that, myself, my equivalent of Logica, and Ed from Cambridge Scientific. We really majored on rapid application development and time boxes. And the time box concept was you set a period of time and you said at the end of that period we will deliver. We'll either vary the delivery or we'll vary the resource, but we will never deliver the endpoint. Yeah. So there are a whole variety of techniques which have been developed over the years which handle IT procurement in various ways. What we're going to be doing with Excelos is to actually create a method or tool which says, well, here we do it waterfall, here we do it with time boxes, this is where we use Scrum, And this is where we use what I'm going to come to in a minute, what I call pre-Scrum techniques in Agile. The stuff do you do before you can even think about a 2-week sprint with a high degree of iteration. Because what Scrum is attempting to do is to refine a basic defined requirement. Pre-Scrum techniques in Agile try and work out what the hell that requirement should be in the first place. And I'm going to argue later one of the reasons for failure in IT is we haven't yet done enough work way up the supply chain. And what we should be focused on is dealing with unarticulated needs using existing technology. Finding ways in which technology, which can now do things that users don't know how to ask for, how can we get them to interact with that technology so they understand the potentiality? So when they ask for things which not only we can deliver, but won't create downstream disappointment because they realize the wider potentiality. So that's an example of a both-and approach. Yeah. And it was interesting. I was working with Telstra in Australia. And one of the things we know about Agile is it's very prone to fads. You know, there's kind of like the Scrum Tribe, there's the Kanban Tribe, and then there's the basic heresies of things like SAFe, all right, which as a good Catholic I regard as a profound heresy, for which order to pay is probably about the only solution. So there are all these different factions and approaches, all of which are trying to compete for training and accreditation revenue. And if I'm being brutally cynical, they're more interested in training and accreditation revenue than they are in delivering software. It's kind of like that's become the primary intellectual driver of Agile. Isn't actually good software, it's good training and good accreditation. And that's problematic in terms of the way it works. So to come back to this, yeah, what we're trying to do is to basically say, first of all, where are different techniques and tools appropriate? So Scrum for me is a technique by which you take something which is on the borderline of complexity. It has multiple possibilities, but the possibilities are contained and restricted by the initial user requirement. And then we go through a linear iterative process to get it right. So in terms of the Cynefin framework, and we'll spend half a day on this in the 2-day masterclass, so I'm making a few assumptions here. In the Cynefin framework, Scrum is a technique to take things on the boundary of complexity and make them complicated so that they can be scaled and replicated and used as a production delivery. And that's really powerful, but we just need some more stuff before we get into that. Yeah. Equally, if you look at some of the disputes around Kanban, and Lean Agile Scotland this year, I basically said Kanban representation couldn't handle complexity, and immediately got lashed with a tweet storm from David Anders and others who of course made their living on Kanban. Either way, we had an interesting tweet discussion, and I ended up going for 3 days to stay with this team in Dubai. And the point I made is the basic concept of Kanban is work in progress and work in progress management. And its representation as a series of cards in boxes in a linear flow is entirely appropriate for work in progress in a complicated domain. But it's inappropriate for work in progress in a complex domain where you're not quite sure what the things you are that you have to deliver yet. So it's not that the work in progress concept, which is what Kanban is really about, is wrong, but the way we represent it in complicated is different from the way we should represent it in complex. In complex, and we're experimenting this with fitness landscapes, we effectively draw requirement clusters as landscape maps with contour lines. And as the contour lines start to coalesce and their boundaries become clear, then you're shifting it to the point where a conventional Kanban approach will work. But in the more ambiguous stage, you're looking to actually effectively trigger potentialities rather than actually progress-defined tasks. So again, you see this both-and concept. The WIP process is right, but the representation has got to be different based on the relationships between cause and effect. Because of course, in a complex adaptive system, you're not dealing with linear cause and effect. You're not dealing with the system where you can know what the right answer is. You're dealing with a system where as you interact with the system itself will change. So it's only through multiple interactions with the system can you see where the stabilities occur. And of course, when the stabilities occur, then you can produce software. So let me give you an illustration of 2 pre-Scrum techniques that we're working on. And we'll give people a chance to experiment with these. And actually, I'll go through 3. Laurie, remind me if I only do 2. Right?
Okay.
Not quite the Spanish Inquisition, if you know your Monty Python, right? But I want to do 3. So either way, so one of the ones we're looking at is to take a technique I originally developed in DSDM. Now, DSDM was the British-based and now international consortium which codified RAD and JAD. It's an interesting story on its creation. I was in strategy in a company called Data Sciences, which was Anglo-Dutch. Our main competitor was Logica, and still was, and still is in various guises. At the same time, we had Cambridge Scientific, who were doing some interesting work through Ed. Now, what we all worked out is if we got together as competitors and created a training, we could establish a field. If each of us tried to do it as a commercial company, it wouldn't have that credibility. That's kind of like a lesson that the Agile movement hasn't really worked out yet. And to some extent, Scrum Alliance does, but not completely. Yeah. So either way, so we got together, we created a standards body. I put Tony Mobbs on it for us, and it all went well. Now, I then started to experiment with new methods, and one of the ones I was looking at was biological mutation. This was when I started to look at natural science and say, what does natural science teach us about social systems? So I knew that if a system comes under stress, mutation radically increases. Because actually, although that produces effectively mutations which are non-beneficial, it increases species variety overall, so it increases resilience for the species. So if you stress a community, mutation rates in not just DNA, but actually RNA, which means it can happen in real time, actually starts to increase radically, and that produces disease, it produces cancer, but at the same time it produces novelty, which gives species survival capability. So I thought, let's copy this. So what we would do is we'd organize 3 RAD teams, i.e. highly trained prototypers, people who could very quickly throw code together. In those days we were working with 4GL, some Prolog, some early stage Java, so it's fairly technical. And they were arranged on 3 time zones on 8-hour time differences, so effectively we could do 24-hour programming. And the first workshop we'd throw users who had a ill-defined requirement together with coders. And over 8 hours, we'd knock ideas backwards and forwards. The users would say, I'm frustrated by this. What about this? Can you do something? The programmers would knock something together and say, is that what you meant? And the user would say, no, but that's actually quite good. Can we do something with this? And we'd play around. Right? At the end of 8 hours, we'd have a series of prototypes, which were then passed on to the next programming group on an 8-hour time difference. But they weren't allowed access to the original user requirements. All they could see was the output of the session. And they were told to improve it. And they spent 8 hours on that, and they were allowed to add other things in if ideas occurred. At the end of 8 hours, they passed it on to the final team who worked on it for another 8 hours, and then it came back. So there's a British game called Chinese Whispers, in which kids line up in a row and you whisper a message in one ear of your friend, they whisper it to the next person, to the next person, the next person, and it's quite fun to see what happens. So I was replicating that. On every occasion that we run it, at the end of the session, the users would look at it and they would say, I would never have thought of that, but that's brilliant. Can we have it? Yeah. Now, again, you see what we're trying to do there is actually increase the coevolutionary interaction between software capability and fragmented, ill-defined needs. The more you structure things, the more you define them, the less variety is possible, the less adaptive, the less resilient they are. Yeah. So that's an example of a pre-Scrum technique. Yeah. The second technique we're working on, and this is going to be announced, a consortium-based thing from the university. So we'll have space for about, I think, 20 or 30 companies to join it worldwide. And I'm currently negotiating to get agreements with universities to provide local focus. So if anybody knows what in India is interested in technical university, let me know, because it's a gap in the network at the moment. We're kind of like, okay in Australia, okay in the States, okay in the UK, okay in South Africa, but we're missing something on the subcontinent here. Right? So the concept here is over a year and a half, maybe 2 years, we'll actually work on a narrative-based approach to user requirements capture, in which you never actually go and ask the users what they want. You get a sample of the users to continuously record their day-to-day frustrations, the things which don't work, the times when they say, why can't technology do something for me? The things they hear at a conference or a friend says over a drink in the evening. Anytime they think of something or get frustrated by something, They put it into the system either as a web link, an oral recording, a picture or text or whatever, and they interpret it onto, this is into Cognitive Edge's SenseMaker product, which uses what's called high abstraction metadata, yeah? High abstraction, highly ambiguous metadata. And then we look at patterns in the way that they're indexed. And the minute we get a cluster, a statistically valid cluster of narratives, then a pair programming team are allocated to that cluster to produce a prototype, which then gets distributed to the users, which says, you haven't asked for this, but we think it would deal with these problems. Do you want it? Now, again, we're working directly with user narratives there. We're not using story points, let alone epics. So we're not allowing somebody to interpret people's experience. We're using with that direct recording of the experience in real time, which of course is also different from the recalled experience when people are brought into a workshop, where they also have the performance stress of knowing that what they say will result in a system for which they'll be responsible.
Right.
So that's an example of unarticulated need. Yeah.
That's good.
And the third technique we're working on, and this is more generally applicable, what I sometimes call distributed decision support or mass sense, is where we basically, and I'll give you an example we're doing on cyber security at the moment for the British government. So what we're doing is taking, and it's quite interesting, this came from an interesting experience I had 2 years ago. I was in Florida for a week, and I spent the first 2 days working with one of my favorite clients, who's one of the world's leading fashion houses. And that means you stay in really nice hotels. They don't stay in hotels with stars, because if you need stars, you really don't understand quality. And I worked with their top 200. We ended up with the Paris Ballet being flown into the Moroccan desert to perform to their top 200. And we were all given white linen suits for the occasion. So this, you know, I allowed one indulgence in my life. This is the client that does that. I then went on from that to a meeting of the US intelligence agencies. This was in Tampa. So I went Miami to Tampa. I think it took me 3 hours to get through security to be allowed in. I was one of 4 keynotes along with people like Clapper. So I've got 2,500 intelligence agents in a mass hall from the NSA, the CIA, military intelligence, etc. And the bastards announced that Snowden was keynoting at their conference and put me on first, but didn't say which Snowden. As Clapper said afterwards, we maximized attendance. Right? Either way, what we did is, after we'd overcome slight disappointment, all right, a certain amount of trepidation on my part of walking onto stage, we presented a situation on Syria. We got everybody in the audience to interpret it into high abstraction metadata in 30 seconds, and then we presented the results back. Now, that's actually quite powerful. That's being used for distributed decision support. We're doing that across the UK government at the moment. So we're presenting an example of a cyber breach in industry. We're using the Yahoo case as an infographic. Every civil servant then interprets that onto a series of high abstraction metadata, which we've worked on with the security experts in GCHQ. Yeah, so it's well researched and well academically founded. They all interpret it in the same time period, and then we draw the fitness landscapes from that, which measure attitudes to cybersecurity, because attitudes is a lead indicator, whereas compliance is a lag indicator. And all of complexity is about increasing anticipatory capability, not predictive capability. You're building systems which anticipate possibilities rather than trying to predict them. So I now want to take that technique, which you've also used, for example, monitoring attitude to safety, into 2 major areas. One I'll be talking about at a big conference in New York in 2 weeks' time. We're launching a whole series of collaborative projects around early stage or weak signal detection in software testing. That's our 3rd big Agile project. And that will be launched with the Software Testing Association of the US, preliminary conference in New York in 2 weeks' time, and then a bigger one in Tennessee in a month or so's time. Yeah. But the other way I'm looking at it is to present, effectively take the story point stuff that IT did people present that to entire user populations who can add commentary and interpret. So we allow real-time mass consultation rather than restricting consultation to participation in workshops or to systems analysts. And one of the other reasons why that's important is if you conduct more than 2 interviews, your brain forms a subconscious hypothesis, and you then only pay attention to things that match that hypothesis thereafter. And the problem with systems analysis is you go in with a set of hypotheses based on the politics around the finance that you've got to run the system in any way. I mean, the political commitment to get investment for systems development is vast these days anyway. So you're already pre-formed before you go and talk to the users. And to my mind, this accounts for an awful lot of project management failure, yeah, and systems failure. It also, if you think about it, is we're moving much more into a service relationship rather than a manufacturing relationship. The other problem I think with Agile is that most of the methods are derived from manufacturing and manufacturing structure. And of course, manufacturing works with a defined product. I would argue in software, most of the time, we're dealing with an unarticulated, ill-defined product. So we need to think more about service and less about manufacturing. And that's kind of like a different approach. It will become manufacturing because it will become structured. But that early stage is semi-structured or not structured at all. And that's where we need new tools and techniques. Yeah? So all of that kind of like fits, if you think about it, within the Cynefin framework. Yeah? Within the complex domain, or the boundary with chaos and complexity, you're dealing with highly unarticulated needs, rapidly changing environments. And this is increasingly the case. I mean, ERP systems, the like of SAP and Oracle, they're becoming increasingly problematic because the time it takes to upgrade them or change them is now longer than the time it takes for a whole market to shift. So kind of like software is holding the business back in some cases because the cost of change is too high. There's some other interesting sidelines here. If anyone wants to talk to me when I'm out in India, I'm revisiting the whole concept of object orientation with systems thinking and with architecture, because I think we need to rethink the way we do software architecture based on a biological or an ecological model rather than a manufacturing or a structured model. And it's actually quite interesting if you look at all the people who claim they're doing something novel and different from TOGAF, they all end up drawing pictures which look just like TOGAF. They just got different names in the boxes. It's still boxes with arrows and linear flows, rather than how you would map an ecology, which is kind of like, well, here's a lake and here's some solid ground, but in between there's lots of marshes and there's lots of woods and we're not quite sure what's going on. And it's very dangerous and you can get trapped in quicksand. Yeah? So you get the ecological metaphor. It's about handling a greater degree of mess before you allow structure to take over. Yeah? Now I think the exciting thing is technology now permits it. We're now moving into very short life cycle product development. We're actually starting to revisit things like polymorphism and inheritance and input-output definitions. The whole of social media works effectively in which the application is an emergent property of the interaction of people with software components. And it's designed by doing, not by design by thinking. Now, I think that architectural approach we need to start to bring across into industry, we need to bring across more substantially into Agile. The ability for people defined as objects to interact with software defined as objects within an architecture which allows radical new applications not only to emerge, but to dissolve and reconfigure in more or less real time to handle high levels of uncertainty. So I think it's a very exciting time to be around. It's also a very dangerous time to be around. And one of the roles of technology is to create capability which will actually allow us to manage our planet, manage our people in better ways. So a final example of a big project we're doing on that, which will illustrate where we're going. We've now got agreement from the Welsh government, provisional agreement from Citra, which is the strategy unit of the Finnish government. We're talking with the city of Trondheim, the city of Portland, Oregon. We're talking with the New Zealand government. I just talked with the Australian Department of Industry about what we call Engage, Empower, Enact, or EQ. Now, what you may not know is that one of the unique things about Wales as a country, apart from the fact that it's not a language which includes words like Cynefin, and if you think Indian names are bad, I shall start to make mine Welsh and then it'll be completely impossible for you, right? Well, one of the things we've done is we've created a thing called the Future Generations Act. No legislation.
Wait. What did you create? The Future what?
Future Generations Act.
Oh, okay.
So it's an act of Parliament which says no legislation can be passed anywhere in Wales unless it takes into account the needs of the next generation. And there's a Future Generations Commissioner who's responsible for enforcing that, who's a good friend of mine. And we're actually now working together. I'm down in Cardiff tomorrow to formalise the agreement. And what we're going to be doing across Wales and then the other countries as they join in the programme is getting children between the age of 16 and 18 as part of their school project to go into their community every month to gather the narratives of day-to-day existence. And that will allow us to create maps that can be looked at by politicians, by local government officials, by community activists, by schools. This is a concept called fractal engagement. The ability to see a map of the territory for which you're responsible, but all the maps are different because the territories are different, but they all come from the same source data. So it's rather like if you're government, you need the map of the whole country. If you're a community, you need the 1 to 25,000 scale. And of course, those maps look very different, although they have similarities as they go up. And what we're doing there is to put a human buffer, a huge network of human beings at the front end of narrative capture to prevent the sort of propagation effects that you see with social media. And I've been arguing for years that social media is dangerous. I said 15 years ago at a conference in Washington, anything an algorithm can interpret, an algorithm will be able to create. Social media will become the problem, not the solution, because people will manipulate it. Now, post-Brexit, post-Trump, people are listening, and therefore we're getting the funding and the resource and the commitment to increase the human agency at the front end of data capture, and actually, particularly the human interpretation. So it's rather like a dampening effect, creating multiple human interactions to prevent the virus of false news, fake news, etc. propagating. I say that's something which was inconceivable in technology terms even 5 years ago, but it's now a new way of engaging citizens, and it's no different from engaging employees. It's the ability for mass real-time engagement and real-time distributed decision-making. And the final point on this, I've just reached agreement with the design school at Stanford University, partnership between Bangor University and Stanford University, to create a complexity-based approach to design thinking, based on distributed ethnography, distributed ideation, and coevolution of product development. Because both of us are equally concerned about the rapid industrialization of design thinking into linear processes with defined workshops, with defined outputs, which destroys creativity and actually prevents radical innovation. So it's an exciting time to be around. We need to recognize that everything we've done so far has value. Agile has value, Scrum has value, Kanban has value, Waterfall has value, time boxes have value, lots of things have value. The issue is to know the boundaries of applicability, because some things work in some contexts and don't work in another. And the attempt to create things and make them universal, to make them the one true way, is the bedevilment of Agile at the moment, and it prevents adoption and scaling. Okay, I've gone on for half an hour, 35 minutes, open to questions, and really willing to have an argument if anybody wants one. I can get even ruder about safe if it's necessary.
I'm looking and I'm not seeing any questions other than some of the questions about the mechanics or the logistics of the webinar so far. I do see that Nupur, your mic is on. Do you have anything that you'd like to ask Dave, especially as it relates to the upcoming master class? Oh, her mic is not on anymore.
She's got a storm, hasn't she, or something?
Yes. There's a problem with the connection because of some heavy rain in India where she is at the moment. And Prashant also is, I think, experiencing this internet connectivity issue. It's great when it works.
If you want to add something in? Sorry, Dan, who teaches this stuff with me for New Cognitive.
Right. Yeah, let's Dan. I'm going to turn on your mic, Dan, and that way you can. Aha, Dan, are you there?
Yes, I am. Howdy.
Hi. Thanks.
Yeah. Happy to chime in. I think one place I'd like to discuss a little bit further is this idea of scientific experimentation. So a lot of Agile practitioners, Lean startup, Lean in general, is really kind of rooted and grounded in this idea of scientific experimentation. How do we validate our hypothesis about our business models, about user needs, and things like that, versus the complexity concept of probes. And one thing I've been trying to do as a teams I coach is draw a bit of a better distinction between experimentation and probes. And I really liked, Dave's comment on triggering potentialities, because I think a lot of the pre-Scrum processes and Lean startup is about triggering potentialities with the environment that you're interacting with. So I was hoping we could have a little bit more discussion on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and I get concerned when people talk, I think as you do, about people saying they're being scientific, because generally they're experimenting with something in a limited context and they're generalizing that experiment. And so Lean Startup, for example, he studies a group of companies who've been successful, which is fine. He identifies things they've done, which is fine, and then he creates a recipe book approach based on that. Now, I remember challenging him on this in New York, because when I was in IBM, we commissioned Harvard to do work on Silicon Valley. But we also studied companies who failed, not just companies who succeeded. And we discovered the companies who failed did all the same things as the companies who succeeded. Yeah, the difference was you had a market, so there were so many actors that some were bound to succeed. So you didn't have a causal model. Yeah, kind of like most people did the same thing, just some got lucky or in the right place at the right time. And there's a body of literature, if you go to Wharton College in Pennsylvania, where they actually did a huge amount of research to identify what we call intrapreneurial rather than entrepreneurial behavior. How do you innovate in a large company where you can't afford the percentage failure we see in Silicon Valley or a market? Yeah. So I think a lot of the science is trivial. It's not really scientific. It's we experiment with some cases till something works, then we'll generalize it. So I think one of the things we're doing is saying that natural science should provide a constraint. So you need to learn about human cognition. You need to learn about the nature of interactivity and causality or non-causality in systems. You need to understand the way that human perception works. You need to understand the whole body of stuff around abstraction. And then any method which is inconsistent with natural science means it's only working in a specific context. Yeah, if it's consistent with natural science, you can afford to scale it. I mean, the way I say that at Agile conferences is if you don't know why something worked, you shouldn't replicate what worked the last time. Yeah. Now, I've actually done a bit of work on this lately. Most of the Agile certification methods are actually based on no more than 2 or 3 initial cases run by the founder. That's not scientific method. Yeah, that's snake oil. Yeah, scientific method would do multiple experiments. It would validate it against what we know from natural science, and it would develop it with competitors and people with contrasting views. It wouldn't just roll it out quickly as a commercial offering.
Right, and would you agree if some of those, you run these multiple experiments, some of the experiments are going to work, some are going to fail. The ones that do work, the ones that are repeatable, now you're in the complicated domain. You're actually not in complex anymore.
Yeah, if they consistently produce the same results, then you can scale them and you're in complicated. Yeah, and the goal of Scrum, as I say, is to make the complex complicated. If they don't get to that stage, then an experiment which fails this time might succeed next time in a different context. Yeah, that's again the mistake people are making. The complex systems are so contextual. Something which didn't work for you 3 months ago might work now.
Right, yeah. Right. I love that.
The real test is your experiment coherent to the constraints of natural science and to the context? So what does natural science say? What does the context say? Right, we can now run it. But you're constantly experimenting, and you're experimenting in parallel, not in sequence.
Right.
The minute something does sequential experimentation, it's not a complex technique. Complex techniques are parallel contradictory experiments. If some succeed, others must fail, because otherwise you're not exploring the space enough.
Right, right. I've seen a lot of teams, say things like, well, we tried that 3 months ago, it doesn't work, right? And
if I'm around with different people, it would, all right? And that's what we're trying to get across. Yeah? The other scary thing is good people can make anything work. I had this argument with some Dean fans the other day, and they said, well, safe is fine because you just use the bits which work for you. And I said, well, there's no point in training people then, because basically you've got good people doing things which are appropriate regardless of what the method says. And good people can make anything work. Good experienced people will make things work. It doesn't mean that other people can pick it up and run with it. Yeah, to pick it up and run with it, you need far more rigor. And you also need apprentice models of training. I mean, we're launching a new master's degree at Bangor, yeah, which is 2 years of part-time study of the humanities and the sciences. You've got to do both. You've got to apply it to a real-world problem you're examining by thesis. But then over those 2 years, you've got to keep a workbook, a narrative-based workbook, signed off by more experienced people. So we're replicating the 2 years that it takes to survive an apprentice model. Yeah? Because apprentice models allow for more learning by failure, more learning by social interaction, more multiple experiences in different contexts before you declare mastery. You can't say, I've done a 2-day course and filled out a multi-choice questionnaire and claim you're the master of anything, right? You're only just getting started at that point.
yeah, I think the boundaries of applicability and knowing when these certain heuristics work in some domains and they don't work in other domains. I think a lot of times when you go to some of these training classes and they don't talk to you or they don't teach you about the boundaries of applicability, I think that really sets a lot of teams up for failure.
Yeah, and they're just repeating it. It's like, again, the safe issue. If you do the 5-day course, you're then allowed to go and do the 3-day course even without experience, provided you pay royalty. And to me, that's criminal. Yeah. If you haven't got experience, you shouldn't be training.
Yeah, do you mind if I pivot to a different topic? So
I don't mind.
Yeah, so a big part about what the Agile practitioner base is searching for right now is this kind of idea of scaling. So, Scrum works fantastic for a 7-person team. How do we scale that to more than 7 people? Well, you do Scrum of Scrums, of course, or you do Scrum of Scrums. And so, there's this idea of scaling. And so I want to maybe have a quick discussion about what scaling looks like and compare and contrast scaling in the complicated domain versus scaling in the complex domain. One of my favorite quotes, I'm not sure if you've come across John Gall's work. He was a pediatrician, system thinker, but he's got this famous quote that a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simpler system that worked. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be patched up to make work. You have to start over working with a simple system. So basically it's this idea that you have to evolve and start with simpler systems that are working as a way of scaling complexity versus Scrum of Scrums, which might work just fine and complicated.
It's also, we know if things get aggregated, they're more likely to fail. There's big arguments about that, about things like banks at the moment. If you look at society level collapse, it's where you get reduction of diversity, increase in aggregation in units. All right. I actually think that there's 2 questions here. One is, how do you get Agile to work across the entirety of software development, not just small teams? And the other is, how do you get executives to buy in? And they're 2 separate questions and people are confusing them. I think architecture is the way that we scale Agile, and nobody's really addressing that. What they're trying to do is to create methods that actually look like the thing they're rejecting. They look like waterfall diagrams. Yeah. And the argument is, well, if we make it look conventional, people will buy it. And somebody said the other day, this is a Trojan horse, all right? So SAFE is a Trojan horse to get people to adopt Agile. And as I tweeted at the time, one which has gone viral, which is causing me some trouble, but some trouble I like, I said, what everybody forgets about the Trojan Horse is that the Greeks massacred everybody and destroyed the town, and their purpose was piracy and robbery, rather than actually advancing a cause, right? So either way, that went down badly in some circles and very well in others. I think 200 likes to, oh my God, why are you saying this? So I said that's a reasonable percentage, right? I think the way you get acceptance from executives is not by building things that they have to put massive investment into on the promise that they will get something in 2 years' time. One of the ways you start to deal with it is to deal with problems that they haven't yet articulated. So IT becomes part of the solution, not the problem. So I think there's two separate things we need to address. Is one, how do we get people to adopt Agile? How do we get executives to buy in and commit resources? And that's not by presenting bigger and bigger and more complicated diagrams, because they will fail, as they are failing now. Yeah? And then people will be more put off because they just put another batch of investment in. They still haven't got the benefit despite the promises. Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's this point you made, Dan. You do small things, you get the benefit. The other thing is, how do we aggregate or group things? And again, I think that's what I was talking about earlier. You can't aggregate things until they become sufficiently stable that actually aggregation works. If they're not stable, you have to decompose and recombine. So you scale a complicated system by aggregation or imitation. You scale a complex system by decomposing it into smaller units, which are consistent, and allowing those smaller units to recombine. Mm-hmm. Now again, the problem is that we're not actually building software at the right level of abstraction and the right level of granularity, so we can get combination and recombination. And again, that comes back to architecture. So from my point of view, the current approach to scaling is based on building some massive construct, when it should be about creating software architectures which include people and software objects, and about creating a whole new approach to get access to the real C-level, not the IT C-level, but the C-level of strategy, of marketing and operations, who have needs which IT are currently a brake on rather than an enabler. And I think it's there that we need to focus.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I'm trying to think of all the scaling frameworks that are out there right now for Agile. Most of them are centered on organizational design and methods and practices. I'm trying to think of a single one that's oriented toward architecture. And
they also assume you can define the requirement. Now, one of the things we know on complexity is you can't deal with endpoints. You have to start journeys. Mm-hmm. So in a complicated system, you can define an endpoint and achieve it, and that's what all current scaled approaches assume. We know, it's 101 complexity. You start a journey, so you discover novelty on the journey. You have a sense of direction. It's called a vector. And you have a sense of coherence about it, but you're open to encounter. Now, again, we got the example with the internet and social media. Nobody architected the solutions. They've all evolved, and they continue to evolve because the granularity is small, the volume is high, the interactivity is easy. So novel solutions can emerge very quickly, and that's where we need to go, I think.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Maybe one more topic, if you will. I think another fairly pervasive, technique or method in the Agile community right now is this idea of measuring progress or maturity models, maturity scales on a scale of 0 to 5, 0 to 10. How Agile are you? Probably pushing a nerve here, but there's all these Agile radar charts. There's these different ways of measuring how Agile a team is based on 0 to 5 on transparency, 0 to 5 on trust, and things like that. So maybe just a little discussion on how does an Agile team know if things are getting better in their environment?
To be quite honest, if things were getting better in their environment, they wouldn't need to be doing measurements, because users would be flocking to them and giving them work. I mean, let's take transparency for an example, all right? Too much transparency, nobody will innovate. No transparency at all, nobody will cooperate. Yeah, the danger is you can take transparency too far. In some contexts, people will trust each other in a stress context, whereas they won't trust people on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. Things like crews mean that people are trained in role, and the roles trust each other, not the people. Yeah. Now, all of these maturity models, I mean, what I find incredible is Agile people think they're being tremendously innovative. They're now adopting a technique which has gone out of fashion in the rest of management over 10 years ago, which is the concept of maturity models, because none of them have worked. Because the trouble is people now focus on achieving status in the model rather than achieving things that the model is meant to measure. They're based on questionnaires that people know what the right answer is to, and they're based on an assumption that the things that are being measured actually produce agility, whereas actually the things which are being measured are observations of things that people noticed worked on a limited number of cases. Yeah. So I would abandon maturity models. I would look at very things you can measure, which is user satisfaction, yeah, user willingness. Key thing is, are users willing to put risky things your way? You want one measure of Agile effectiveness is, will users give you risky projects? All right, if they only give you safe projects, they don't trust you. And actually, if the users trust you, you trust yourselves. It's kind of like, I'm going to put it the other way around. And the trouble is, it's all about these scoring systems. It's like people, if they follow a process, you can see this with United Airlines. I followed the process, therefore I'm okay.
Yeah.
And that's what the maturity models are. Here's this scale on maturity. I've achieved my results. To hell with it. Yeah, it's the wrong way of looking at the problem. And it's not Agile. It's bureaucracy. And Agile is becoming more and more bureaucratic. And that's the scary thing.
Right, right.
Well, great, Dan. I mean, I really appreciate you coming in with these great discussion points. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Yeah. We've got a couple of other questions, Dave. I'm going to open the mic for Anand, and I'm apologizing if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Anand, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Excellent. I wasn't quite sure of your question. I was wondering if you could articulate it for Dave, please.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for this webinar. So when you're talking about like what architecture in terms of like what the application design, should we consider, say there are like what various lines of businesses, if you take a safe kind of a framework, they're trying to maybe come from a business perspective. Is that the primary difference what you're trying to articulate here?
Yeah, but not in the way that SAFe do it. What I'm saying is you need to get involved in the businesses at a more finely grained level with their day-to-day frustrations. And you need to find ways to make small changes which change the way they see technology and change the see the world before you get into large-scale systems development. But yes, you got it right. One of the things I want to start to experiment with is moving pair programming, taking an XP technique and making it a trio. Start to train users to be the third leg of a pair. Because at the moment, we put a lot of effort into training software people, but we don't put effort into training users to understand how to articulate things as software people. Yeah. And yeah, anybody who runs a software business will tell you they're your best software people you never let near your users because they're incapable of articulating things in ways that make users feel comfortable. Yeah. Because they're thinking in the wrong way. So I think there's a lot we can do but we need micro-level interactions, yeah, in semi-structured ways rather than these large structured linear interventions. But yeah, in essence, yes.
Okay, so I think we are already doing that through these Three Amigos meeting and other things, right? Like where we talk about your behavioral driven development, what Goiko Adzik has recommended.
You cut off them, but I would say there's nothing wrong with having meetings with users, ticking the box, but that doesn't mean doing the sort of thing I talked about. Because when people come to meetings, you've already started to form the space. What we're looking at in an articulated needs is actually capturing their experiences not recollected in workshops, but at the time they have that. And that's a basic science thing, right? So the way people recollect things, even 8 hours after they've done them, is different from the way they recollect them at the time. Yeah, so people tend to recollect things in more structured ways, in ways which are by the outcome. if you can capture their experience at the time, it's always different from what you get 2 or 3 days later. So again, I think it's the principle, you're moving it back up the supply chain. Yeah, workshops take place too far down the supply chain to really get to unarticulated needs.
Okay, so in this case, it would be only with co-located teams, which like they would be able to work, right? If say there is a development team based out of say Singapore or Poland or something like that, or even Bangalore, how do they work on this?
Well, I think 2 things, all right. First of all, certainly when I was coding, I actually went on the client site and I met the people and chatted and I coded overnight, yeah? So I was in constant communication with them, but also I had an accountancy qualification, therefore I knew what their issues were. I was that generation where people from professional backgrounds became programmers. Yeah.
Okay.
Now we got programmers who haven't got the professional background, right? So I think increasing co-location is key. Increasing the separation between prototyping and production is key. So your prototypers may need to be co-located with the people doing the job, but your production capability could be offshored, right? But then you move into this stuff we're doing, which you don't need any co-location at all, because users are recording their experiences, so you create story points, become clusters of anecdotes, rather than the actual workshop.
I get your point. But are customers willing to first invest so much of time in terms of coming out with a POC and willing to pay for it and then move to a production model?
You make it non-intrusive. So for example, if you say, look, we want to take 10% of your workforce, yeah, here's an app, download it. Every time they get frustrated by something, ram it into the app. That's a lot less time commitment than having a team, having to spend time with it, going to meetings, yeah? So moving things into, and you might, for example, invest in replacing a workbook or monthly reporting or weekly reporting capability with continuous reporting, put a small system in quickly for that, allow that to gather frustrations. So the secret is, if you do this, it's like we did with the US Army in Afghanistan. If you actually keep your field observations up to date, you don't have to write a patrol report. So by actually removing a burden, by moving it back down the supply chain into distributed real-time capture, you make life people's easier and you get better data. Right? So it's just rethink the problem away from how do we get people to commit time to how do we give them time back from which we can take a percentage.
Okay, I'm going to move on just because we have 2 minutes left, and I've got 2 more questions that actually, Dave, I'm just going to read them to you. One of them has to do with currently, do you know of any large IT or software development organizations that are using the Cynefin framework?
Loads, all right? I mean, but you just do a search on Agile and Cynefin and you'll see loads of examples. Liz Keogh has got quite a few examples with a good webinar, yeah? Dana was on, used it extensively at Intel. We've got massive use at Cisco, yeah? So there's loads. Okay, great. And then I've got another question here about visualize is just one of the 6 practices of Kanban. How are the other practices, how do they score against Cynefin? I think visualization is probably the most important. I think the others all score okay and you could use them in either function, right? But the visualization is the most important thing. Human beings are visual creatures, yeah? And so I think by changing, in fact, we've got a meeting about this next week with some of David Anderson's people, not with David himself. Mm-hmm. We're now starting to look at how do we actually create radical new visualizations, because then the rest of the stuff will follow through okay, I think, all right? I mean, there's some more work to do on this. Okay, and let's see, one quick last question. Design thinking, what you're talking about, how do you get the requirements? I don't know if you can answer this quickly or if you've already touched on it. Similar to the way about unarticulated needs, you're using mass capture over large populations to get wherever workshops. But then you're doing distributed ideation so people can generate ideas over large populations in real time. rather than it just being the design specialist who create it. So at the moment, design thinking uses what they call ethnography, but isn't ethnography. It's a few people doing some interviews and some observations. That ain't ethnography. Yeah. And then the ideation phase is done by experts or to some extent locals. Yeah. We're actually distributing both to much larger populations.
Excellent. Well, we are out of time, and I appreciate everyone's attendance here. And as I said, this is recorded. Dave, any last words?
No, that's cool. Look forward to seeing people in India.
Excellent. Okay, everyone. Thanks very much now.